welcome to today's technique tutorial. My name is Samantha Wiltshire, and today I'll be introducing you to shadows and highlights. So today we're going to walk through the goals and objectives that we have for this lesson, and then I'll be setting you up with the equipment you'll need for today's activity and also with the background knowledge that you'll need about the importance of highlights and shadows and how they work. And that will then allow us to complete a very brief practical activity that will give you some of those foundational skills. And then we'll be concluding and going into some further activities that you can follow up with in order to solidify these skills. So our goals for today are to learn how to use tonal work to develop and improve contrast. So contrast means the difference between our darkest darks and our lightest lights. We want there to be a really clear juxtaposition between our dark and light areas. We need that full range of shadows and highlights in order to make anything appear real. And so when we have that contrast, we create a sense of 3 dimensions. So we are kind of masters of illusion today. We want to make something feel as though we can reach out and grab it and as though the light hits something in real space and in real time. This is also going to, in general, improve our personal problem-solving skills in art making as a whole. So understanding light and dark, understanding how it works, how we can apply it to a drawing is going to help you to perfect any drawing or even any painting as well that you might take on. The equipment that you'll need today is any piece of paper that you have available. It doesn't have to be nice paper for this activity. You'll also need a range of pencils. So I would recommend HB for light construction lines. And then you want probably a range from between 4B to 8B for our shading. I would definitely recommend something nice and dark and soft, like an 8B for our super dark darks. And then if you wanted to have like a 4B or a 6B as well to get more of a range of midtones, you're welcome to add that to your kit as well. You should also have both a kneadable and a hard eraser if possible. Kneadable erasers are great for lifting, but they make very soft edges a lot of the time, and our hard erasers are great for really pressing into that page to lift the pigment off the page or the graphite off the page, and they also can help us to make sharper edges with our highlights as well. If you would like to, you can also use a mole stick, and that'll be to prevent your hand from smudging your tonal work as you go. So if you would like to learn more about what a mole stick is, we have produced a video on that piece of equipment as well that you might like to go back and review before beginning. So why are highlights and shadows so important? Whenever we're wanting to make a successful artwork, we need to understand relationships. As artists, we are relationship experts. And in particular, we really care about the relationships between tone, proportion, and perspective. And so when we put it together, we can make a little formula that accurate shape and accurate tone are going to help us to equal the illusion of 3 dimension. That is our end goal. Shadows and highlights, they allow us to demonstrate how light makes contact with an object. That's why they're so important. It's not only about getting that balance correct, but it's about allowing our viewer to actually understand what it is that's occurring in the space. And we can see here Michael Sims' thylacine study on the right, this image. We can see that the highlights are absolutely crucial for us to understand that the lighting is coming from behind this object in a fairly dark space. And so if these relationships between the darkest dark areas and the lightest light areas are not correct, what we'll do is we'll compromise that realism and that illusion that we're trying to create. It will result in a more flat feeling artwork, and it will result in a less accurate understanding of what our light and our shadow is actually doing in that artwork. And this is generally the case regardless of the overall lightness or darkness of the subject in its entirety. So we can see that Michael Sims' work overall is a fairly dark artwork, but if these light highlights were not light enough compared to these darkest darks, even though it's overall a very dark work, we would not be able to understand the form, or at least maybe not in as much of a successful way as we're able to, given that Michael Sims has created that contrast. So in terms of tone, what is it all about? Let's talk about it. So our white, when we're working with tone, represents the light, and our black represents the absence of light. So any black areas are where that light isn't going to make contact or isn't going to hit. In between black and white, we have a whole range of midtones or grays. And these are our transitional tones between the dark and the light. And they help us to describe to our viewer the various ways in which the light fades as it travels. So as things become grayer, that's giving us information about the fact that less light is hitting this area or more light is hitting this area, rather than white and black, which just tell us there is light or there isn't light. Midtone's about telling us how much of that light might be occurring in a space. And so light either hits, reflects on, misses, or is blocked by an object. It will either hit it directly, it'll bounce off it and reflect on something else. It might miss it entirely, in which case it's probably going to be a fairly black sort of an area. Or if it's blocked by an object, that might be where we have something like a sphere where the light hits one side, and then we'll see a really black shadow on the other side. And that's because no light hits that space because it's being blocked by that sphere, which is in front. And so the darkness of our shadows can be controlled by a few factors. The first factor is by applying more pressure. And we'll have an experiment with this in a minute when we start our activity. So we can press harder, apply more pressure to our drawing materials. We can build gradually in layers, or we can adjust surrounding tones to correct the relationship between them. So if something looks too dark or too light, it is oftentimes worth considering whether it's just too light or too dark compared to what's next to it, rather than in general, because it may be that that tone is correct, but it just doesn't look right because next to it, that area needs to be darker. So we're going to start our activity now. Feel free to get your space set up and ready to go. You may like to print out this template on this slide. It has a nice chart for us to now fill in our tonal scale. So we'll flick over now to my drawing station and I'll show you how we can approach this activity. Okay, so as mentioned in the equipment list, these are woodless graphite pencils. I love woodless graphite pencils because I can get them right on this nice edge here to shade, and also because again, it's a nice thick piece of graphite in there, so rather than dropping it and then it internally shatters that stick of graphite, it's a little bit more solid and resilient. And again, if I drop it, it just breaks right in half. I sharpen the other end and now I have two pencils. So I've got my darkest one of these today. This one is an 8B. So I'm going to start with our tonal scale today. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is to begin our tonal scale, we'll press really, really hard with this darkest pencil. So I'm pressing really, really firmly as I can. And then to start to create my midtones, I will be gradually releasing that pressure. So gradually taking it off, not too suddenly all at once, because otherwise you won't get that full range. And I'm going to be more and more gentle until I reach white. And there's our tonal scale. So that's us practicing how pressure is going to influence how dark or how light our result will be. So now let's practice building our tone in a different way. In the previous tonal scale that we just made, we were pressing our drawing materials, our pencil, really, really hard to get that black, and then we were releasing pressure through our midtones towards our whitest white. Now what we're going to do is with our pencil, we'll try building these darkest shadows, but only by lightly applying multiple layers over the top of one another. So we're almost kind of stitching over and over and over the top to form the full tapestry of the artwork. That's a nice way to think about it. And so we're going to try this today with 3 different pencil types to also understand how which pencil we select for this task is going to impact our final result. So in this first box, which you might like to print out or just do yourself on any page, we're going to be trying to build with an HB, so something very light. Then in that second box, try a 2B or maybe a 4B to get into more of that mid-tone range. And then we're going to be building layers with 6B or 8B, so they're going to become very, very dark. So let's flick over now to my drawing station, and I'm going to do that quickly with you. Now let's have a go at understanding how layering can help us to achieve a similar effect. So I'm actually going to start with my lightest pencil for this one. Let me grab my HB. So here, starting with my lightest pencil, my HB, which is what we'll be using for our construction lines today, I'm going to just place down an initial little area of shadow. Just one little area, coloring it in. Now you can use the box provided on the slide if you find that helpful. But for me, I'm just going to create any old shape, and you're welcome to as well. So there's my little box of a mid-tone. Now, rather than trying to press firmly to make this darker, I want to see how dark I could possibly make this just by going over and over again. So I'm coming back on the top, and I'm not pressing any with any more pressure. I'm just coming back over the top again and again with the same amount of pressure. And this doesn't have to be tidy, guys, because this is just an experiment. If you wanted to treat this like a science experiment, you could even count how many layers of this you need to do and write underneath each type of pencil how many layers it took you to achieve that darkest dark. So because this is HB, it's going to take me a really long time. But I have now progressed from around about here to somewhere over here in my tonal scale. And now we're starting to be down here in these much deeper midtones. And it's not as black as I could get with my 8B, but if we kept pushing it, maybe we could get closer. So I'm trying again. Let's see how many more layers it might take. All right, I probably could still build a little bit darker than this, but we're probably getting to about the expectation of how dark we can create with an HB pencil. Now let's compare this to what I can achieve with a 4B. So you can use either a 4B or a 6B or anything in between HB and 8B. So here's my 4B pencil, and let me now try the same thing. Look at how similar these are already, and I've only done a few layers, so we're already getting so much darker, so much faster. And wow, now in only a couple of layers, I'm going to overtake that HB pencil by a mile. And here I go, I'm already in that really super dark range of my tonal scale, way down here. In a really short time span. So this is a great exercise to understand how to layer as a process, but also to understand the differences in your pencil types. So what you'll find is not only will this demonstrate to you how much you'll need to build in order to get those dark darks with different types of pencils, but you should hopefully also be able to feel a textural difference. So your darker grade pencils, your 4Bs, your 6Bs, and your 8Bs will feel very, very soft, and that will make it really easy for the graphite to transfer onto the paper, and it will make it much more easy to build up into these dark tones. Whereas your HB, it will feel much more compact and much less soft and blendable, and it will also be really labor intensive for you to build up that tone. All right, now let's have a go with my 8B. And remember, just because we can make a pencil darker more quickly doesn't mean it's necessarily a better pencil. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So if I was trying to achieve some really, really subtle, super light tones or values, then using an 8B for that straight off the bat may not be the best approach. As you'll be able to see that I was able to get far more subtle lighter midtones with my HB than I've been able to get with my 4B and my 8B. Right, so there we can see that really, really quickly, I've been able to get a very, very dark shade already with only a few layers of that 8B pencil. So now we're going to continue to the next stage of this activity. In this stage, you're going to probably need to flick to a new page or go to a new area on your page that isn't taken up by your drawings yet. And we're going to be applying these techniques of building shadow to an actual 3D object. So what we've just learned to do is to adjust our depth of our tone by applying more or less pressure and by applying more or less layers of our pencil over the top. And now we need to understand how light actually hits an object so that we can apply these skills. So in this activity, we'll be drawing first a cube and then a cone. We're going to be following a really basic construction process today to make these shapes. And today we will not be addressing using perspective or vanishing points to make these shapes. We'll be doing that in a future tutorial. So we'll be doing the really basic and easy version of building these shapes today. It will mean that you may have less accuracy, but for today, we just want to build a really basic foundational understanding, not necessarily walk away with a beautiful Michelangelo artwork. When we have completed our scaffolding, we're then going to be erasing any areas of it that we don't want to be able to see in the final product. So we're going to want to press quite lightly when we do this so that it won't be challenging for us to then erase anything we don't need. So I'll flick over to my drawing station now and we'll take a look together. All right, now let's flick back to our HB pencil because it's time for us to construct our basic geometric shapes that we're going to be using for today's activity. So just as a reminder, we want to use that HB because it's nice and light and we may want to rub out these scaffolding lines later. And also we're not going to be going into perspective today. So we're not going to be talking about how to use a vanishing point or a horizon line. We're not going to be using any of those processes. We'll just be using freehand drawing techniques today to create these shapes. So in order to construct this cube, what you're going to start with is a nice straight line, like so. And then you're going to come down with a vertical line this way, and then a corresponding vertical line on top. Once we've done that, we're going to be able to join them. And now we're going to have one square side of our shape. You may well find that you need to adjust them. So for me, I'm going to need to come in and straighten this line, which is looking a little bit wide to me. So we're remembering that when we're constructing, we're not committed to any of these lines in any way, all right? I'm not married to them. I can rub them out. I can move them. So keep them nice and light. I am doing mine a little bit darker so that you can see well on my camera. You can do yours even more gently and even lighter than this. So I'm going to get my hard eraser now, and I'm going to move around some of these lines that I'm not feeling happy with. All right, so there is my initial square that I'm going to be using. Oh, that angle doesn't quite feel right. You might take a little minute to adjust, especially if you haven't done a lot of drawing before. You might find it a little bit tricky to get your square shape to begin with. So I've got that first face. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a line out vertically from each corner. Here I go. There's a nice vertical line from each corner. Be careful if you're wanting to flick little bits of eraser dust. I can do that at this stage because I know it's not going to smudge. But if I had heavy, dark shadow already on my page like so, I wouldn't want to just flick over. I'd want to be very cautious because any flicking I do on top of that is going to transfer the graphite across other areas of my page that I might like to be nice and clean and tidy. All right, so now I've created this base for my cube. I'm going to come in and I'm going to create the side. And then I will come in and create the top. So remember to angle the top upwards slightly because we want them to feel kind of parallel to what they may be across from. And now you have a nice cube to use for this activity. And you can rub out any lines that you don't need, although we will give it a final tidy up at the end when we've applied our tonal work. All right, now let's approach our cone. So our cone is going to have an elliptical base. An ellipse is a kind of like a oval, but imagine someone maybe squashed it a little bit more. It's quite narrow. And there are lots of ways that we can use vanishing points, perspective lines, and also squares and rectangles to form accurate ellipses, ovals, and circles when we're drawing. Today, we're not going to be covering that. If you already know how to do that, feel free to go for it. We're just going to be attempting freehand today as best as we can. And so you may need to adjust your ellipse for the base of this object for a few minutes to make sure that you're happy with the final result, since we don't have scaffolding to give us more control today. Okay, now let's create our cone. So our cone shape, we're going to use our X-ray vision. And remember that our cone shape is going to have an elliptical base. So if you're not very confident drawing a freehand ellipse, and don't worry, we will cover how to draw accurate ellipses, circles, and ovals in perspective in the future. But for now, if you're not feeling comfortable, I'd recommend you're going to hold your pencil like so, and we're going to use our pinky. We're going to hold it up like a lady at a tea party. We're going to place that pinky down on the page, and this is going to be a whole movement that we're going to create. So have a little practice. You can see how I'm stabilizing myself with that pinky. I'm going round and round and round, and I'm using the motion to create that ellipse shape. And it may well be that it's on a bit of an angle that I need to fix. Mine's a little bit wonky. Once I've got that basic shape though, I can now come in with my eraser and rub out anything I don't need. And a great way to get great at drawing ellipses in this way, using your finger to stabilize yourself, is to just do a full page of these as practice. I know it seems a little bit arduous, but it's a really fantastic practice. And it's going to mean that over time you become a really confident freehand ellipse, oval, and circle drawer. So now I'm coming around and I'm just clarifying what I've done and finding that final shape of my ellipse. There we go. There's my ellipse. Now, I haven't drawn these as though they're in the same space. If these were in the same space, it would look like my cone is about to topple over. I'm treating these today as two separate drawings, all right? So now I've got the base of my cone. What I can do is do a crisscross right through the middle. I'm trying to find the center of that shape. And there it is now, I found it. So you should be left with something at the moment that looks quite a bit like this. Now what we can do is we can pull the line up from the center. And that's going to determine how tall we would like our cone shape to be. Once we've decided we're happy with the height, we're now going to be able to come and join on either side to that central point. So you're coming from the edge of your ellipse up to the center point. And remember, it's really normal not to get this right on the first go, especially if you're not as experienced with construction drawing. This will probably take a little bit of practice. So now, just like before, I'm coming in and I'm cleaning up anything that I don't need or that I don't want. Again, I'm going over my drawing a couple of times to make it dark enough for you to see on my screen, but you may find that all it takes for you is one swipe of the pencil up from the base up to the top. And then if that works out for you, you don't need to keep going over the same line over and over again, because what it will do is it will just make it darker and darker. And we may not necessarily want that, because that could be a light area that we don't want to make muddy with all of that graphite transferring.
All right, so I'm coming in and I am clarifying anything I can see that might be a little bit wobbly or not quite right. Guys, if you're drawing in a seated position like I am to be able to film today, it's really important that you occasionally stand up and look at your shape from far away, because otherwise you'll end up with a warped drawing. And so because I'm sitting down to make it easier to film, that's what I'm doing, because I can see already when I stand up that there's some things that are a little bit wonky. So try, if you can, you guys, to opt for drawing on an easel where you're seeing it front on. Like you would if you were an audience member looking at something hanging on a wall. And certainly try and opt for an easel over your knees. If you had a choice between an easel, a table, and your knees, I would be choosing the easel every single time, because the angle that your knees might be pointing is also going to warp that drawing. So I don't know how well you can see on my camera, but I just erased that line so that I can still see where it went, but it's not quite as dark because I wanted to adjust where it's going. And watch out for leaning tops. Watch out for pointy hats that have the top bent over, because that can tend to happen when we're drawing pointy shapes. We can tend to start to curve off in some other direction as we're constructing. The next stage of this activity is now going to require us to understand where the light is going to be hitting this object, like we discussed. So we need to know, where does the light hit? And then where are the areas that the light is not going to reach? And so what we will do to begin with is draw a very simple little sun shape in the corner, quite lightly, and that's just going to vaguely indicate to us where we would like our light to be coming from. So remember that you can swap sides. You don't have to put your source of light on the same side as me. If you would like a challenge, have a go at putting it somewhere else and see how you go. But we will do a more in-depth discussion at a later time about points of light and how to understand them. So today I would recommend just choosing a really basic point of light, one side of that object or the other side of that object. Once you know where your light source is going to be coming from, you'll then be able to know which side of the object will have a cast shadow. So that's this shadow that's on the ground. So that's the area where the light is being blocked by the object in front. And so you're going to draw your basic shadow shape like I have. I'll be showing you how to do this in just a moment. And then that will help us to understand our dark side, our medium side, and our light side of our shape. It's important for us to remember that our source of light is quite a complex thing to deal with. So we're using a really simple sun today just as a tool for this introductory activity, but we know that that our source of light, especially if it might be the sun, not only will it be maybe on one or the other side of our object, but it could be behind our object. It could be actually behind us where we're standing. And it's also very relevant that if we have a source of light, like maybe a desk lamp or multiple sources of light even, that it may be coming from this side, but from closer to us or a little bit further back or from an angle. So keep in mind that the light has a great deal of complexity. And what we're just looking for today is a very basic understanding of that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm now going to place my sun where I think the source of light is going to be coming from. So in this case, I'm going to put my little sun right over here. And then for my cone, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I want it to be coming from this general direction. So there's my two little suns. Remembering that it could be closer to us, it could be further away. Points of light can come from any which direction. So this is a really simplified understanding of light, just for the purposes of getting our base understanding today. And then sometimes what I do is I also do some little sunbeams. To help me understand the direction in which that light is traveling.
So there I go, there's my sunbeams. And now that's going to help me to understand where my cast shadow is. So that's the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, if this is where my light is coming from, then this is going to mean that my cast shadow is going to be around about here. And you can kind of adjust it until you find something that feels around about right to you. So it should come right out from the very edge of your shape. And this is that area where the light is going to block, is going to be blocked entirely by the shape which is in front. Oh, and here I am standing up, making sure from a distance that that looks correct, and I could tell that it did not. So double check from far away. All right, so there's my first cast shadow, and you may find it around about this point that that you decide that there's actually things about the shape of the square that you're also not happy with. So it's okay at this point, before we put tonal work on, to still make a couple of little adjustments. It's not too late for that. So I think I've decided that I'm seeing a little bit too much of the top of my square. I'd like to see a little bit less of the top and a little bit more of those sides. So I'm coming in and making a few adjustments so that I'm going to create the best result. And I would recommend going for a little bit more emphasis on the sides than the top, because that's where we're going to be practicing our tonal work today. So you should now have your cast shadow on your first shape. Now what we can do is start to work on the cast shadow for our cone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come right from the edge of my cone, just like I did with my square. I mean my cube, my apologies. And that'll help us to make that cast shadow. So I am putting my shadow in a direction that implies that not only is my sun over here, or my light source over here, but it actually might be a little bit closer to us. And if you do that as well, that's okay. If you end up with a cast shadow that would suggest that it's a little bit closer to us, or it's coming from more of like a slightly front-on angle, then that's absolutely all right, as long as you are understanding the main side from which your light is coming from for this exercise. That's okay, because we'll get into more detail about complex points of light in future videos. All right, so now you'll have your cast light The next light source that we need to map in is where that midtone is going to turn into the lighter side of the object on our cone. So if our light source is coming from here, that now means that we're able to map in around about where the light will start turning into midtones in our cone. Now remember that because this is a triangular shape, it shouldn't be the same length the whole way down, all right? If you have a shadow shape on your cone that looks like this, you're not going to get a very realistic feeling cone. It's going to look not quite right. So we want to bring it down with the shape of the cone. It's going to form like a triangular area of its own. And remember, all of this is going to be very light, much lighter than I'm doing on my camera for you to see. So there we go. There's my shadow shaping or my shadow mapping on my cone. And now I don't actually have to do a great deal of shadow mapping on my cube, because my cube, I know that if the light's coming from here, maybe we might move it up here a tiny little bit. If my light is coming from here, then I'm going to have my lightest side, my medium side, and my darker side, because this is the side facing away from our point of light. And of course, same as in this instance, although we know our light's coming from this side, it may be coming from slightly closer to us or slightly further away from us. And so depending on where that light is, that would affect our cast shadow. For now, just copy and follow along with my cast shadow. You'll still get a really lovely three-dimensional looking shape. And then we will revisit understanding how these shadows and their shapes are going to be affected by our light source in a future lesson. You also might notice I'm starting to get my page quite smudgy, and this is where the need for a marl stick may come in for you. I'm not going to be using one today because I'm drawing flat and because I can clean up nicely with my eraser. But if you're really struggling with the smudging today, then you may find that it's helpful to pop this on an easel with a marl stick. All right, so now we've established our shadow shaping. Now we've made a map of where our light is coming from and where our shadows are and aren't going to be. We need to start to understand the intensity of those shadows, and we need to start to see these values. So the darkest dark value is going to be where the least light makes contact, as we've already discussed. And a lot of the time this will be directly underneath shapes and directly behind shapes, because light can't creep in underneath where it hits the surface, and the light will be blocked directly behind that object. And so if we forget these important shadows, or if we underplay them, if we make them too soft, our objects are going to look like they're floating rather than sitting down with weight and gravity on their surface. And our objects, of course, are going to look less realistic and less three-dimensional. So it's really important that we're not afraid to make our darks dark enough when we start to apply tone. If we neglect those darkest shadows, or on the flip side, if we also muddy our brightest highlights, we will lose some of that contrast, and that's going to throw out those relationships. It's going to throw out the balance. And we know that we need all of those relationships to be in harmony. They need to be all one big happy family in order to produce a successful artwork. And what we'll also practice doing is using squinting as a tool today to help remove some of the detail of what we might be seeing, and to help us to kind of understand where are our largest vague areas of darkest dark and where are our largest vague areas of lightest light. All right, so let's now practice squinting. Squinting is a fantastic tool, as we mentioned before, to blur our shape and remove some of that distracting detail while we're just looking for the really basic darkest and lightest areas. So I've got this photograph of a simple geometric shape here. And what I've done is I've edited this photograph to be blurry, and that's going to mimic what it looks like when we squint our eyes. We can also see this gentleman squinting here. We're all going to practice that together. So squint your eyes, glare at my screen as though it has said something really rude to you. That's going to make everything blurry. And you should be able to notice on your screen already, where are the darkest areas of my computer screen and where are the lightest areas of my computer screen. And we can see on this shape, I have now numbered my darkest and my lightest tones. So I've started from number 1. Number 1 is my darkest dark. Then squinting, I can see that number 2 is the next darkest dark. And I've started to number my zones as they gradually get lighter until I was left with number 6. And number 6 is going to be my absolute lightest light in this particular image. And so I've left highlighted specifically the number 1s and the number 6s because that's my darkest area and my lightest area. It's really important that I understand what is the shape of each area and where those areas are going to be located. I know if I don't get them right, I'm not going to have an accurate image. So what you can do is you can take the drawing of the finished product of this activity today from the slides by grabbing a screenshot, and you might like to squint at those. Otherwise, we are drawing these shapes using our imagination today, which means that we don't have a reference to squint at. In the future, though, I would love for you to progress towards having a real cube or a real cone object in front of you and using squinting as a tool. Another factor that's going to influence how we build shadows on these objects is going to be our edge sharpness and our shading direction. So before we apply any of this tone, we need to understand that a sharp edge on an area of shadow or light or on an object is going to do a number of things. It's going to make our object in that area look very clear. It's going to make that area jump into the foreground. And that is called atmospheric perspective. So the fact that things become sharper and more crisp when they're close to us, and things become blurrier as they recede into the distance, that helps us to describe perspective or a feeling of distance. It also helps us to understand the difference between a rectilinear or a harshly edged object and a curvilinear or a softly edged object. So today we've got a cube, and that is a very rectilinear object. It's going to have hard edges, and there's going to be sharp edges as well, with sharp boundaries between the different tones. Our cone, on the other hand, is a curvilinear object. So it's got a rounded surface, and that means that we're not going to have clear, sharp edge boundaries between our tones at all times. We are, in this instance, going to have some soft and more subtle tonal transitions around the side of that object. So we know that sharp versus soft edges, they help us with our atmospheric perspective to make things look closer or far away, and they help us to understand whether a subject is a curvy shape or whether it's a very structured, sharply edged shape. And also keep in mind, your eyes are like a multifocal camera lens. And so we can blur or sharpen edges on purpose in our art making. So you are now your own multifocal camera lens. If you want to push something into the background, you can blur it on purpose. If you want to bring something closer to us, you can sharpen it on purpose. All right, and here's an example of this hard and soft edge. So here we can see that the finished product of our cube is going to have very sharp boundaries between our tones because it's a sharp edge. We can see that there. And then we can see that because our cone turns and is curvy around its edge, we'll have that more subtle transition. And now we can see that there is an image of what the final product will look like for both our cube and for our cone. So what you might like to do now is to apply that squinting technique. You can squint at your screen, or if you've printed these sheets out, you can squint at your printout. And now you can, for yourself, find your darkest general area and your lightest general area and your largest area of midtones. And that might help you with some of this shadow shaping if you're struggling. So not only does it matter how sharp or soft those edges are and how dark or light those shadows are, but it also really matters what direction we move our pencil, because we can use directional lines to help us describe shape and the way things turn in space. So when you shade your cube or your cone, these are the directions on my PowerPoint slide that your pencil lines should be traveling in to describe the form. So we can see that because the surface of this cube goes this way, we'll need to do lines that go in this direction. It'll be the opposite on the other side. And then these lines travel straight out from the object for this shadow down below. It's really contrasting to see that next to this cone, because it's a curvilinear shape, our lines are in some ways going to be wrapping around the shape of that cone to describe its curvy form as we apply our tone. So we can see that now the cone also has a cast shadow here in the same way that our cube does. So that's that shadow which is created because the light is blocked from reaching this area by the actual object itself. And we can see that this shadow comes straight out from the object. It doesn't curve like the surface of the object itself. So similarly to for our cube, we're going to have to use lines that come straight out in order to describe that shape. So now we're going to start to shade by applying our darkest dark area first. So your darkest dark is going to become your key, like a key on a map. It helps us to determine everything else and what it all means. So you're going to refer back to that darkest dark every time you put a new midtone in. You're going to ask yourself, how dark does this midtone need to be compared to my darkest dark as my point of comparison? That's how we'll begin. So flick back over to your drawing and let's do it together. All right, so now we've got our construction down, we can do away with our HB pencil. We won't need that for anything else, unless there's some very light tones that we feel that we're struggling to get with our darker pencils. And what we're going to do now is swap over to our darkest pencil. So to your 6B or your 8B, for example. And so we're keeping in mind what we just learnt about the direction in which we should shade, depending on the face of the object. And we've also kept in mind that we can squint at the picture of the final product on the slide if we would like help kind of really recognizing where it needs to be super dark and where it needs to be super light. So when I start shading, I always try and start from the absolute darkest dark first. So I'm getting my very, very dark pencil. And I know that in this instance, the darkest shadow is going to be where the least light reaches. And that's going to be right up close against the edge of my shape. And in general, just in this cast shadow. So I've gone along the outline a little bit because I know that my cube will have nice sharp edges. And now as I continue to shade, I'm making sure that I'm trying to do my lines in the direction of that shadow. So nice horizontal pencil strokes. Now I know it is a little bit scary to go in with your darkest dark first. It can feel like a very permanent thing to do. And so it is okay if you're not feeling confident to go a little bit lighter and then to build darker much more gradually if you prefer. But I do think that sometimes going in with the darks first, it acts as that key that we were talking about before. And it B means that you're not at risk of creating a very mid-toned drawing with not a lot of variation. So I might do a little bit of a crisscross in another direction over the top if there's little areas that I feel haven't been filled well with my pencil, but I'm still trying for the most part to go in the direction of that shadow wherever possible to help describe how it travels in space. And remember that it is okay to stop for a minute, to clean it up, to make sure that you're happy with it. Even at this stage, we can still adjust if we need to. And now I have to be very, very careful when I'm trying to get these bits of eraser off because I don't want to transfer that very dark pigment everywhere else all over my page. And I'm standing up as well. I'm walking around it. I'm seeing it from far away. Remember that we always need to be doing that to yours as well.
Okay, so there's the very, very darkest dark on my cube. I know that the next darkest dark for me is going to be this face here, which is also facing away from the light. So I'm now starting to come in, and if I need to give myself a bit more of a guide around the edge, I can. And now I'm going again in the direction of the face of that shape. Now there is going to be a bit of a texture created by the grain or the tooth of your page in this work. And we're not learning about kind of the final texture of our rendering today. That's for a future video. If you want to learn more about that, you can go and take a look at the smooth rendering video if you'd like to learn how to make this smooth and tidy. For now, we're just learning how to create those tonal variations in the right places. And I know that I need very, very sharp edges. I don't want blurry edges at all because this is a rectilinear shape. And so if I have soft edges, it will feel like it's in the distance rather than nice and close to me. So I am going up and down along those edges if I need to, just to make sure that they're as crisp as they should be. And now I can darken further. So I'm going over to darken and to make sure that it feels nice and even. I want to make sure that there's no patchy bits where it looks a little bit lighter and it doesn't really make sense. All right, so now I've got my two darkest tones in for my cube. I'm going to go and do the same thing for my cone. So traveling with the shape again. But that's going to be most important on this shape around the middle where it's a curved surface, because otherwise we're not going to get the sense as well as we should that that surface does curve around. Be careful as you put in the shadow about unintentionally over rounding the edge of your base. That is an easy thing that we can fall into the trap of doing, is changing the shape of the bottom of our cone unintentionally when we're popping in this cast shadow. And we've been doing shadows today with very harsh edges, but remember that not all shadows are going to have sharp edges. Oftentimes we might even see an initial shadow close to an object with a sharp edge, and then another blurrier edged shadow kind of that's falling over the top of it. All right, so now what we can do is we can pop in our second darkest shadow area on this shape as well. And we know that that's going to be this side over here. And it's not going to be quite as dark as this shadow, which is cast underneath it, but it will be much darker than anything we'll have happening around the other side. So I'm going to go ahead, and you'll see that I am now wrapping my pencil ever so slightly around the shape. I don't want to do it too abruptly, because if I start to do shapes like this, it's going to feel very, very strange. I just want to move with that slow, subtle curve of the shape. And so I am again building with trying to make it feel nice and even in mind, because we're not going over and blending in any way today. We're just going to leave it as it is. So try your best to get a nice consistent looking even tone. And we will have a nice sharp edge up the sides. We just won't have any sharp edges where the midtones shift on the middle of the object. So I'm going to have to rely quite a bit on releasing the pressure as I try and shift it into the next midtone over. But this is going to be our darkest midtone, and as we layer with a lighter pencil, we're going to find that really, really helpful. All right, and I'm thinking about it also as a triangle shape, just like how I did when I thought about my light area. So I know that it's going to become a narrower shadow as it creeps towards the top. Alrighty. So there's my darkest set of midtones. I might even darken the furthest side away from the light a little bit more because I really, really want this object to feel like it turns in space.
Now it's time to apply our midtone. So we may do this by releasing pressure or by doing less layers over the top of that area, or a combination of both. Try first by just releasing the pressure and then see if some areas might need to be darker. Those areas which need to be darker, you can build on top of them in another layer. Now I'm going to start to move into that lighter variety of tones. So I'm going to get my next lightest pencil, which for me is my 4B, and I'm going to start to describe those next areas. So on my cube, I'm now moving in this direction. Remember that on the previous side, we were moving in the opposite direction, in the direction that the face points. So make sure to shift to that next angle that I'm going to need to be on in order to get the best possible result. And this is going to be significantly lighter over here because it's closer to the light. And now my main mission is going to be to make it not too light and not too dark, exactly how I would like it, and also to get that nice even surface again. And remember that as an artist, I'm that relationship expert. So if the relationship is wrong between the midtone area and the darkest dark, I am absolutely still able to go in and to adjust that. And if the edge between the two faces of the shape is not feeling sharp enough for a cube, I can always come and adjust that too. So I've decided to make this side over here one little bit darker still, just to really create some contrast between the two sides. And now I also know that this edge needs to be nice and sharp here too. So I'll come in and adjust that next as well. I can get my HB pencil one more time. And if I feel like I need to adjust any edges of any other areas, I can.
So sometimes when we apply tonal work, we might sneakily push out the edges of things or warp the shape of things, and it's important to double check yourself. All right, and now I am getting my 4B pencil. And I'm going to start to apply the next layer of lighter midtones on my cone. And because I know I'm approaching that lighter area, I am being a little bit more tentative, like a little bit more cautious. And I am still adjusting my pressure as I go, but I know if it's not perfect, I can come back with that process of layering. So if something's not right, I've still got ways that I can adjust. Alrighty, and now I'm actually going to swap over to, I think, the lightest pencil. I'm actually going to go to my HB, which I don't often use for shading unless I've got some really, really subtle midtones that are quite difficult to get with a darker pencil. So I could try and just release the pressure more, but as a bit of a catch safe, especially while we're still just learning, swapping to that lighter pencil can be really helpful. So you may find that the lines actually become almost horizontal towards the middle because there will be a side which kind of faces us, which won't feel as curved. But then as we start to head up in this direction, we need to make sure that we're curving it again so that we maintain that sense of the three-dimensional shape turning in space. I'm going to have to be really, really careful with my pressure now because I'm trying to get the absolute lightest area. And by the way, if drawing right on the point isn't working for you, try and get your material on that side is really helpful. Sometimes I switch to more of the point when I've got lighter areas because I don't necessarily want quite so much pigment going on. I want a little bit more control. And now I'm going over the top and I'm just going through a bit of a process of evening it out. So anything which doesn't look quite right, I want to get rid of those little patches. And there should be no harsh lines coming through the middle. This is an area where we need that really soft transition to make it feel like it turns. Alrighty, and remember, I could still come back to those initial dark areas. If they're not feeling dark enough now, if the relationships are off, then we need to correct those relationships. It's really important.
Now, as the final stage of this activity, we're going to get our eraser, both our hard and our kneadable eraser, and we're going to be cleaning up any errors that we might have made, any smudging that might have occurred. If some smudging has occurred along an edge which needs to be a very sharp edge, then it's going to be in particular really important for us to clean that up, because remember that whether or not the edge is sharp or soft helps to show whether that object is close or far away and whether it is a harsh rectilinear object or a soft curvilinear object. So I'm going to be using my hard eraser for really removing any stubborn smudges and for getting some nice sharp shadowed edges. And then I'm going to be using my kneadable eraser to maybe lift any midtones that might be a little bit too dark, or to squish it into a nice pointy shape to get into any difficult nooks and crannies. Okay, so now we've used tone to describe both our highlights
and our shadows, what we're going to do is a final cleanup with our eraser. So I tend to like to get a firm eraser to start with, and that's going to be to clean up any edges which went blurry that need to be quite harsh. Our kneadable eraser is good for really lifting off to a very clean surface and for getting those sharp edges. And I can also get rid of this source of light now. I don't need it anymore. And I'll do that to both my cube and my cone while I have them here. So I'm going right around the edges of my shapes. And I often find it really, really helpful when you get all of these little bits of debris to lift up your artwork and give it a tap. When we don't want to transfer any graphite into the light areas, that's where tapping it off can be better than trying to flick it off with your fingers. I also feel that I would like a slightly sharper and darker base right here on my cone because it's still feeling like it's floating a little bit to me. All right, now I've used my hard eraser, I'm going to get my kneadable eraser. I'm going to kind of squish it into a desired shape. So this is a kneadable eraser. Sometimes we also call this a putty eraser or just a soft eraser. I'm going to get a nice sharp edge and that's going to help me to sneak into any of these little areas which are a little bit hard to reach with a clunky big eraser. I'm also going to be doing lots of standing back from my work at this point in time because I need to see how that optical illusion looks from further back. And another thing I don't want to happen is I don't want a super dark edge here. So you'll see that I'm actually dabbing and lifting that line of the top of my top surface of that cube. Then I could come back in with my HB. I might have lifted it a little bit too far. So I want to bring it in just a little bit more, but not as dark as it was previously. That was a little bit too dark. Be careful because sometimes that kneadable eraser, because it squishes as you're holding it, it can bend into shapes that you're not quite anticipating and that aren't ideal. So you may have to take your time to adjust it as you go. All right, and now I'm going to come to my cone. And again, it's really important that I don't feel as though my line on my light side is too light. I'm going to squish my kneadable eraser into the right shape and come in and get rid of any extra smudging that I don't need on the side of that cone so that I'm preserving that 3-dimension. Another thing I can do for my cone is I can get my kneadable eraser, and if anywhere is too dark or too harsh in the transition between the tones, I can just give it a little bit of a dab. To soften it, to take it back just a tiny bit. And then I might get my lightest, softest pencil, my HB, and if I overlifted anywhere, that's also something which I can now come in and address. So do be careful of overlifting. It's really easy to do. So I'm having to come in and make some corrections because it might make it less even. But then you should hopefully be left with a nice, tidy result like this. That's going to feel really lovely and 3D. Certainly pretty good for a first go at rendering a drawing. Good luck, everybody. I hope they work out well.
All right, congratulations for completing that activity with me today. I would recommend that you should show your finished activity to your classroom tutor for some additional feedback. And we also have a list of some of the references and acknowledgements for today's session here. And remember that the long-term goal is not only to complete this activity and get feedback in the short term, but projecting into the future, we want to work towards having more control over our tonal application and over the finish that we create. So whether or not things are smooth or whether we would like to build some texture. In the future, aim to expand to toned or colored papers as well. And then you could try applying your highlight with white chalk, pastel, or Conti stick instead. You may now like to continue on to watch our smooth rendering video. In this video, we further practice and extend these skills. And we also learn how to make a very, very smooth and refined, finished, toned surface. So have a go, see what you think. And as always, thank you so much for your time, and I'm wishing you happy art making.